Margaret Ashworth woke before the sun most mornings. Not because she had to, not because an alarm told her to. She woke because the house made sounds in the early dark that she had learned to listen for over 41 years. The settling of old timber, the particular groan of the east wing boiler finding its warmth, the soft knock of the garden gate when the wind came from the north. She knew each sound the way she knew her own heartbeat, without thinking about it, without having to. She was 58 years old, and she had lived in Harrow Hall her entire life. Her father had been the caretaker before her, his father before him. There was a photograph somewhere in the east corridor of her grandfather standing in front of the main entrance in 1947, wearing a flat cap and a serious expression, holding a pair of shears as though they were something important. They were important. Everything about the house was important. That was the thing about a place like Harrow Hall. It demanded a particular kind of attention, the sort that never fully stopped, even when you were sleeping. The hall had 42 rooms. Margaret knew all of them. She knew which floorboards squeaked under pressure and which ones only complained when the weather changed. She knew that the third window in the drawing room had a latch that needed to be lifted at a slight angle before it would close properly, and that if you forgot to do this and left it overnight, the room would smell of damp by morning. She knew that the boiler in the east wing had a personality, stubborn in January, cooperative in spring, unpredictable in autumn, just like certain people she had known. She made tea each morning in the kitchen that had been her grandmother's kitchen, which had been her great-grandmother's kitchen before that. The tiles were original Victorian, cream and dark green, chipped in a few places, cracked in one corner where her father had dropped a cast-iron pan the Christmas she was 7. She remembered the sound of it, the way he had stood there looking at the broken tile with an expression that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite resignation, but was somewhere between the two, the expression of a man who understood that some things, once broken, simply become part of the place. She had never replaced that tile. She never intended to. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October. It came in a cream envelope with a solicitor's name printed in the top left corner. Margaret recognized the name, a London firm, the sort that charged by the sentence. She stood at the kitchen table and read it without sitting down. Then she read it again. Then she folded it in half and set it under the sugar bowl and put the kettle on. The hall had been sold. It had not been sold to her, and it had never been hers to own. She understood this. The Fenwick family, who had owned Harrow Hall since 1892, had finally reached the end of what several generations of optimism and several more of poor financial management could sustain. There had been debts accumulating quietly for years, the way water accumulates behind a dam, invisible, patient, and eventually decisive. A creditor had called them in. The estate had gone to auction. Margaret had not known about the auction until it was over. She made her tea. She sat down at the table. Outside, the garden was full of the particular golden light that October produces in the late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look as though it is being seen for the last time. She thought about her father. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen. She thought about the tile with the crack in the corner. Then she put on her coat and went out to the garden, because the roses in the east border needed attention, and they were not going to attend to themselves. Callum Vane was 41 years old and had, by anyone's measure, done well for himself. He had not been born into money. He had been born in a flat above a chemist's shop in Newcastle to a father who drove a delivery lorry and a mother who worked 3 days a week at a school canteen. They were not unhappy people. They were practical people, which in many ways is more useful. His father had taught him two things with great consistency: that you should always know what something costs before you agree to it, and that sentiment was a luxury that other people could afford. Callum had taken both lessons seriously. He had studied finance at a university where he felt slightly out of place for 3 years, and then felt at home for 1, which is the natural order of things. He had worked for other people for 7 years, learning everything he could about how capital moved, where it stalled, and what happened to assets when the people who owned them ran out of the energy required to maintain them. Then he had started buying things himself. He was good at it. Not lucky. Good. There is a difference. Luck runs out. Skill compounds. He bought a warehouse in Bristol that no one else wanted because the roof needed replacing and the location seemed awkward. And he replaced the roof and discovered the location was perfect and sold it 3 years later for 4 times what he paid. He bought a struggling mill in Yorkshire, converted it into apartments, kept the original machinery as features because the people who bought the apartments found the history charming in a way that surprised him and made a substantial profit. He bought a hotel in Cornwall that had been hemorrhaging money for a decade and turned it around in 2 years by the simple method of paying attention to what guests actually wanted rather than what the previous owners thought they should want. He bought Harrow Hall because it appeared on a list of distressed estate properties his team compiled each quarter. He bought it the way he bought most things, efficiently, without drama, without going to see it first. He had learned to trust the numbers. He sent a letter, a standard notice. He had a solicitor for this. He did not go himself. He had 14 other properties in various stages of acquisition, renovation, or sale. Harrow Hall was a large asset with considerable renovation potential. There was a regional market for converted estate properties and a particular appetite for the kind of historic authenticity that Harrow Hall had in abundance. He had a plan for it. The plan was sensible and well-researched and made good financial sense. He did not think very much about the woman who lived there. 6 weeks after the letter, Callum drove up the long gravel approach to Harrow Hall on a gray November morning with a folder of contractor quotes on the passenger seat and a meeting scheduled with his project manager for the afternoon. He had not expected her to still be there. She was in the garden, not near the garden, not passing through the garden. She was in it, in the literal sense, kneeling in the mud of the east border, with both hands buried wrist-deep in the earth, working at something with focused, unhurried attention. She was wearing green Wellington boots and a waxed jacket that had seen better decades, and she did not look up when his car came down the drive. He sat in the car for a moment, watching her. He got out. He walked across the lawn, which was wet and soft underfoot after the recent rain. She still did not look up. He stopped a few feet from her and said good morning. She said good morning back. She did not stop working. He asked if she was Margaret Ashworth. She said she was. He told her who he was. She said she knew. She pulled something from the earth, a root ball, dense and reluctant, and set it to one side, then began working at the space she had cleared with a small fork. He asked what she was doing. She said she was replanting a rose. He looked at the plant beside her. It didn't look like much. A bare, thorny cane with some root attached to it, pale and unimpressive in the gray November light. He asked if she thought it would survive being moved at this time of year. She said that some things survived better if you moved them before the hard cold settled in. Then she added, without looking up, that she supposed he had come about the renovation plans. He said he had. She said she would make tea when she finished, and that he was welcome to go inside and wait. He was not accustomed to being told to wait. He went inside and waited. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something that might have been bread baked earlier that morning. The tiles were old, and some of them were cracked, and the whole room had the settled, permanent quality of a space that had been used daily for a very long time. Callum stood at the window and looked out at the garden, where Margaret was still working with the same focused patience. After a few minutes she stood, stripped off her gloves, and came inside. She washed her hands at the sink. She filled the kettle. She did not apologize for making him wait. He found, to his mild surprise, that he did not mind. He laid out his plans over tea. He was clear and efficient about it. The house would be converted into a high-end event venue with accommodation, 12 guest suites, a restaurant in the old dining hall, a wine cellar in the actual cellar, a spa facility in the outbuildings. The renovation would take approximately 18 months. The budget was substantial. The projected return was solid. He showed her the initial drawings. Margaret looked at them. She turned the pages slowly, and she looked at each one without expression. And when she had looked at all of them, she set them down and picked up her teacup. She said, "It's not about the money." He had offered her a generous settlement, enough to buy a good house in the village, or further afield if she preferred, enough to be comfortable for a long time. She said it again, quietly, as if she was clarifying something rather than making a point. It was not about the money. He asked what it was about. Then she looked out the window. The garden was darkening. The light was going fast. She said that some things were difficult to explain to someone who had not grown up understanding them. He was not a man who took well to being managed or gently dismissed. He said, with measured politeness, that he was a reasonable person and she could try. She looked at him for the first time with full attention. She had gray eyes and a directness that he recognized as the kind of calm that comes not from confidence alone, but from a long familiarity with difficulty. She said, "My grandfather planted the oak at the south end of the drive in 1953. My father repaired the library ceiling with his own hands after the leak in 1987. My husband and I painted the east wing in the summer we got married, in the same color it had always been, because I had a chip of the original paint I had saved for 12 years in a matchbox, waiting until I could afford to have it matched properly. I am not a sentimental woman, Mr. Vane. I am a practical one, but practical people know that some things have a value that doesn't appear on a balance sheet." She said it without heat. She set down her teacup. She said she would show him the rest of the house if he wanted to see it. He did want to see it, which was the first thing that surprised him. She showed him all 42 rooms. It took the rest of the afternoon. She walked him through the house the way a person walks through a place they have memorized, not deliberately, but by repetition, turning in the right directions without thinking, ducking her head slightly at the low beam in the passage between the old servants' quarters and the main corridor, reaching for the light switch in the upstairs landing without looking. She explained things as they went, which parts of the structure were original, which had been repaired, and when, and why. The history was not recited in the way a tour guide recites history, as a list of dates and names arranged for effect. It was given the way a person explains the workings of their own home, matter of fact, specific. In the library she showed him a section of ceiling where the plasterwork met a structural beam at an unusual angle. Her father had done this, she said. He had spent 3 weeks on that ceiling, lying on a board suspended between 2 ladders, working with his hands because he couldn't afford a plasterer. When he was finished, he had come downstairs and sat in this chair. She indicated a particular armchair by the window, and fallen asleep for 2 hours. She was 14. She had sat in the chair across from him and read a book, and felt, though she could not have named it then, that she was watching a man who had done something true. In the east wing, she showed him the window frames she had repainted the previous summer. She had used a color mixed from that chip of original paint she had mentioned, a particular shade of cream with a warmth to it that wasn't quite yellow, not quite white, specific in the way that colors are specific when they have history in them. In the upper corridor, she stopped outside a door and was still for a moment. He asked what was in there. She said storage, which was not quite a lie and not quite the truth. She moved on. He noticed she did not offer to open it. By the time they came back to the kitchen, it was fully dark outside, and the house was quiet around them, with the specific quality of quiet that belongs to large old buildings at night. Not empty, but settled, as if the place was listening. He looked at his contractor quotes on the table. He looked at the tiles on the floor, the cracked one in the corner. He asked her how long the crack had been there. She said, "Since Christmas 1974. My father dropped a cast iron pan." He looked at it for a moment. Then he gathered his papers and said he would be in touch, and she walked him to the door and said good night. And he drove back down the gravel drive with the oak tree that someone's grandfather had planted in 1953, visible in his headlights, reaching its branches over the road. He did not sleep well that night. He could not have explained why. His project manager was a woman named Claire, who had worked with him for 6 years and understood his methods thoroughly. When he called her the following morning and said he wanted to revisit some elements of the Harrow Hall plan, she asked him which elements. He said most of them. There was a pause. She asked if something had changed in the structural survey. He said the survey was fine. He said he had walked the property and he wanted to think about the approach differently. She said she would reorganize the planning meeting. He went back to Harrow Hall on the Friday. He told himself this was because he needed to do a more thorough assessment of the property. This was true and also not the whole truth, but he was a practical man and he did not examine it too carefully. Margaret was in the kitchen when he arrived, mending something. She put it aside without comment and offered tea, and he accepted, and they sat at the table. He told her he was reconsidering aspects of the renovation. He asked her questions about the house, which structural elements were non-negotiable from a heritage perspective, which outbuildings were in the best condition, what the drainage situation was like on the north side. She answered each question precisely and without elaboration. She knew everything. The depth and specificity of her knowledge was remarkable. Not academic, not referenced, but immediate. The way a surgeon knows the body, not from a textbook, but from years of handling it directly. He asked about the locked room. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said it belonged to her husband. He died 12 years ago. She had not been in to sort it yet. He did not ask anything further. She did not offer anything further. They sat for a while with the quiet between them, which was not uncomfortable in the way he would have expected. He was not a man who was easy with silence. He had filled most of his adult life with purposeful noise, meetings and calls and plans and projections. But this kitchen and this woman's particular way of being in a room seemed to have its own terms, and he found himself accepting them. He left in the early afternoon. At the end of the drive, he stopped the car and looked back at the house. It was not beautiful in a showy way. It had the beauty of something that had been faithfully maintained over a long time, a steadiness to it, a settled confidence in its own form, the kind of beauty that doesn't call attention to itself. He had not bought it for its beauty. He bought it for the numbers. He drove away thinking about the numbers. He also thought, more than he had expected, about other things. He came back the following Friday, and the Friday after that. He did not announce these visits in advance. He told himself this was because he needed to make assessments and it was easier to see things without preparation. Margaret accepted his arrivals without surprise or comment, which was either very gracious or very amused. He was never entirely sure which. On the third visit he stayed until dark, and Margaret made soup from something she'd grown in the kitchen garden, and there were 2 bowls on the table when he came in from the east wing, and he sat down without either of them deciding that this was what was going to happen. He asked about the boiler first. She explained its habits with the patience of someone who has explained an elderly relative's habits many times and long ago stopped finding them unusual. He asked about the drainage on the north side. She drew him a diagram on the back of an envelope, precise and clear. He asked about the history of the kitchen garden, what had been grown there, what the soil was like, whether there had ever been any formal planting scheme. She told him about the kitchen garden at some length. Her grandmother had kept it. It had been substantial during the war, and immediately after, vegetables in every bed, fruit trees along the south wall, a particular kind of apple that Margaret could not now name but could remember eating, tart and dense, nothing like the apples in shops. The garden had diminished over the years as less was needed and less attention was available. Margaret had kept it going in a reduced form. She grew what she used. She grew it well. He asked how she learned. She said she learned from watching. You watch something enough times, and the knowledge enters you without your noticing. He thought about this. He said it sounded like how he learned to read a balance sheet. She looked at him with something that might have been amusement. She said she supposed it was. She said she had never thought about a balance sheet and a kitchen garden as belonging to the same category of knowledge. But she could see the argument. He said most categories of knowledge were the same if you went back far enough. She said she thought that was probably true. They ate the soup. The kitchen was warm and the house was quiet, and outside the wind was moving through the oak tree at the end of the drive, with a sound like water. He asked about her husband. He was not sure why he asked. The question was out before he had fully decided to ask it. She did not stiffen or look away. She said his name was Robert. She said he was an engineer. She said he could fix anything mechanical and was entirely helpless in the kitchen, and that she had loved him completely for 23 years and had been angry at him for dying for several years after, and was no longer angry now, only grateful, which she had not expected. He asked how old he was when he died. She said 51, a stroke, without any warning, on an ordinary Tuesday. She picked up her spoon. She said, "You carry it. That's all. There isn't a secret to it. You just carry it, and you keep going, and eventually, the weight becomes familiar, and that's the best you can say." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said his father had died 4 years ago. He said it the way you say something you don't often say, briefly, as if speed will keep the weight of it manageable. She said she was sorry. He said they had not been close. His father had been a contained man. Not cold, but contained. And Callum had spent a great deal of his life being very busy, which was its own kind of containment. And by the time he had enough stillness to know he had wanted to know his father better, his father was gone. He stopped. He stopped. He was not sure when he had started talking. Margaret said nothing. She did not try to resolve what he had said or make it more comfortable. She just let it sit there, which was the right thing to do, though he had not known he needed the right thing until she did it. They finished the soup. He thanked her. He drove home. In the morning, he called Claire and asked her to push the Harrow Hall planning meeting by 2 weeks. He had his team pull together everything they could find on the history of the estate. This was not unusual. He always researched his properties. What was unusual was what he was looking for, not the structural history, Not the planning history, not the listed building constraints, though he read all of those. He was looking for the human history, the people who had lived there, the Ashworths, specifically. Margaret's grandfather, Thomas Ashworth, had started as an undergardener in 1939 and been made head groundsman in 1946, after the war took both the men who had been senior to him. Her father, William, had taken over as estate caretaker in 1972. Margaret had effectively taken over the role from her father in the early 1990s, when his health declined, and had continued it after his death in 1994. She had been there alone, with her husband Robert, until 2012 when Robert died. And she had been there alone since, 41 years. Through changes of ownership, the Fenwick family had cycled through 3 different principal owners in that time. Through a period in the early 2000s, when a development company had offered to buy the estate and convert it, and the offer had been declined. Through another offer 6 years ago from a hotel group with celebrity backing and considerable resources. Margaret had, on both occasions, made clear that she intended to remain and that her presence was non-negotiable. The previous owners had, on both occasions, declined the sale rather than proceed without her. He read this twice. They had declined the sale rather than proceed without her. He looked at the photograph his team had found in the county archive, a photo of the East Wing taken in 1988, presumably for some record or assessment. The paintwork was the same color it was now, the exact same color, the warmth in the cream, the specificity of the shade. He thought about what she had said. 12 years saving a chip of paint in a matchbox, waiting until she could afford to have it matched properly. He looked at the East Wing window frames in the photograph, and then he looked at them in the current survey photographs, and they were the same. He sat back in his chair. His assistant appeared in the doorway and asked if he was ready for the call with the structural engineer. He said to give him 5 minutes. He sat for 5 minutes thinking about a woman who had saved a chip of paint for 12 years. Then he took the call with the structural engineer and was perfectly efficient and focused, because he was also still that person. The person who had learned to stay practical, to stay useful, to keep the numbers moving. He had not stopped being that person. He was just also, increasingly, something else. What that something else was, he had not yet fully named. The blueprints arrived at Harrow Hall on a Wednesday. A delivery driver with a rolled tube and a signature form. Margaret signed for it and set it on the hall table. She waited until the evening. She made her dinner. She washed up. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened the tube and unrolled the drawings. She had seen the initial drawings he had shown her in that first meeting. These were more detailed. Room by room, floor by floor, the full scope of what was planned. She had known, in a general way, what would happen to a house like this when a man like Callum Vane bought it. She had known it and braced for it. Knowing a thing is coming and seeing the specific shape of it are different experiences, and she moved through them quietly, alone in the kitchen, while the house settled around her. The kitchen was marked as a utility room. The old range, which had been her grandmother's, which had been replaced once, but replaced with the same model because that was what the space required, was indicated for removal. The tiles, all the tiles, including the cracked one in the corner, were shown as cleared for new flooring. The east wing, which she had painted, was indicated for conversion to guest suites. The windows she had researched and restored were shown with new double-glazed replacements. The upper corridor, the locked room, she found it on the floor plan. There was a notation beside it. Storage to clear, convert to ensuite bathroom. She sat with this for a long time. She rolled the blueprints back up. She put them in the tube. She set the tube exactly where it had been on the hall table. She went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she had not slept well in 12 years, and she was accustomed to managing the night hours without distress. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, doing what it always did, settling, breathing, making its slow adjustments against the cold. And she thought about Robert, and about her father, and about her grandfather's oak tree at the end of the drive. She did not cry. She had not cried in a long time. Not from hardness, but from a kind of economy. She had learned to spend her energy on what remained, and not on what was gone or going. In the morning, she got up and went out to the garden. The rose she had replanted in the east border had taken. The new growth was small and tentative, barely worth noticing, but it was there. She noted it. She went inside and made tea. Callum did not come the following Friday. He came on a Monday, in the early morning, which was unusual. He drove up the gravel drive, and she heard the car from the kitchen and stood for a moment in the middle of the room, aware of a feeling she could not quite place. Not anxiety, something more like attention, the feeling of something that has been quietly building now being close. She let him in. She did not ask why he had come on a Monday. She made tea. He sat at the table. He had a cardboard tube with him. He set it on the table. He said he wanted to show her something. He unrolled the drawings. She saw immediately that they were not the same drawings that had been delivered. Same format, same scale, same level of detail, but different. She leaned over the table and looked. The kitchen was the kitchen. The range was where it had always been. The tiles were marked as original tiles, retained. A note in the margin said, "Heritage flooring, preserve in situ." The east wing windows were marked as restored sash windows. Original profile, draft-proofed. The wall color was noted as, to match existing, heritage paint match required. She moved through the drawings page by page. He sat quietly and let her look. She came to the upper corridor. She found the room. The notation beside it said, "Not for renovation. Owner's discretion." She stood up straight. She set her hands flat on the table and looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was careful and a little uncertain, which was, she suspected, an unusual expression for him to wear. He said that he had been thinking about the project differently. He said he thought the approach needed to change. He said a house like this had value in its specificity, in the things that made it exactly what it was and no other place, and that destroying those things to make it more generic would be to misunderstand what he had bought. She asked if this was a financial conclusion. He said it was partly a financial conclusion. He said there was a growing market for estate properties that offered authentic historical character rather than renovated approximations of it. He said the numbers supported a more careful approach. She said, "And the other part?" He was quiet for a moment. He said the other part was less easy to quantify. She said she thought it probably was. He pulled another sheet from the roll. He had made a separate document, a brief, several pages, on the history of the estate and the Ashworth family's role in it. He had had a researcher compile it. The documents were from the county archive, from planning records, from a couple of old newspaper articles she had never seen. There was the photograph from 1988 of the East Wing. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She said, "I didn't know anyone had taken this." He said he had found it in the archive. He said he thought she should have it. She sat down. She held the photograph in both hands and looked at it. It was 1988. Robert was alive. Her father was still alive. She had been 20. She would have been the one painting those window frames in the image. though you couldn't tell from this angle. She remembered that summer, the smell of the paint, the way Robert had stood at the foot of the ladder, telling her she was doing it wrong, and laughing when she ignored him. She set the photograph face down on the table after a moment. She picked up her tea. She asked what he wanted from her. He said he wanted her to stay. He said it practically. He said the estate needed someone who understood it, and that no renovation company, however skilled, could replicate what she carried in her knowledge of the place. He said he needed someone who knew which door stuck in the wet season, and who the right person in the village was to call about the boiler and what the drainage situation was on the north side in winter. He said he was offering her a formal position, estate manager, which was essentially what she already was, but with a contract and a salary and proper terms. She said, "You don't need me for the plumbing." He said, "No." He said it simply, and he looked at her with that careful, slightly uncertain expression, and the kitchen was very quiet. She thought about Robert. She thought about her father. She thought about the rose in the east border with its tentative new growth. She thought about the chip of paint she had saved for 12 years in a matchbox because she knew, without being able to say exactly how she knew, that the color was worth saving. She said yes. She said it once, quietly, as a statement of fact. Then she stood up and said she needed to go and check on something in the garden, and she picked up her gloves from the hook by the door and went outside, and the oak tree at the end of the drive was visible from the garden in the morning light, its bare November branches reaching in all directions, steady and enormous, and completely sure of where it was. The renovation began in March, when the worst of the winter had settled, and the house was ready for the kind of work that required scaffolding on the outside walls. Margaret managed it. This was not a surprise to anyone involved. The project manager Claire had initially been uncertain about the arrangement. She was accustomed to working within clear structures, and the role of estate manager had not previously featured in any of Callum's projects. But she had visited Harrow Hall twice in the planning stages and had quickly understood that Margaret was not a variable in the project, but a fixed point around which everything else needed to organize itself. Margaret knew where everything was. She knew what couldn't be moved, and what would need to be protected during the work, and what was resilient enough to manage on its own. She had strong views, expressed without dramatics, and she was nearly always right. The contractors learned this quickly. The lead builder, a large, patient man from the town 12 miles away, who had renovated 3 other estate properties, told Claire at the end of the first week that he had never worked with a client representative who understood load-bearing walls the way Margaret Ashworth understood load-bearing walls, and that he meant it as a compliment. Callum visited most weekends. Sometimes he stayed through the week if there were decisions to be made. He had a room in the east wing that was the first of the spaces to be made habitable. A clean, simple room with a window that looked out over the garden, a bed and a desk and not much else. He worked from the desk in the evenings. He was used to working from hotels, and he found, as the weeks passed, that this was different from a hotel in ways that took him a while to identify. It was quieter, not silent. The renovation work made considerable noise during the day, but quiet in a way that had depth to it. The house's own quiet, which existed underneath the work and returned each evening when the builders left. He and Margaret had dinner together most evenings when he was there. This had begun as a practical arrangement. It was simpler to cook one meal than two, and Margaret cooked well with the directness she brought to everything. It evolved into something that neither of them commented on or examined too carefully, because it seemed to function best when approached as a fact rather than a plan. They talked about the renovation, They talked about the problems that arose in old buildings when you pulled walls back and discovered what was behind them. The surprises, good and bad, that were part of working with a house that was genuinely old. A section of the kitchen garden's south wall turned out to have been built partly on medieval foundations, which the heritage officer found very interesting, and which created a 2-week delay and some paperwork. The east wing revealed, when the outer plaster was taken back in one room, a section of original decorative stonework that had been covered over in the 1930s and was in remarkable condition. Margaret stood in front of it for a long time, not saying anything. They talked about other things too. Callum had begun, somewhere in the previous months, to tell her things he had not especially planned to tell anyone. The way this happened was gradual and almost unnoticeable. One detail in a conversation, then another in the next one. Nothing dramatic, nothing confessional, just the ordinary accumulation of a person allowing another person to know them. He told her about the delivery lorry, his father behind the wheel in the early mornings, patient and reliable, and going to the same places in the same order for 26 years. He told her that he had spent a lot of his adult life moving as far from that lorry as he could get, building as much distance between himself and the flat above the chemist's shop as possible. Not from shame exactly, but from a hunger for something different, something more, and that now, at 41, in a 400-year-old house in the middle of nowhere, with mud on his shoes and plaster dust in his hair, he was not entirely sure what that hunger had been trying to reach. She listened. She did not offer comfort or resolution. She had a gift for letting a thing be what it was. He asked her once. It was a Sunday evening in late April, the garden starting to come to life after the winter, the kitchen garden in particular showing the signs of Margaret's attentions. He asked her what it felt like to have spent her whole life in one place. She thought about it for a while. She said she wasn't sure she had spent her whole life in one place. Exactly. She said she thought she had spent her whole life in one relationship. With the house, with the people who had been here, with everything that accumulates in a place over time. She said it was more like a long conversation than a fixed location. You come back to it, and it has changed, and you have changed, and the conversation continues from wherever it left off. He said that sounded like a good way to live. She said she thought so. She said she had also wondered, at various points, what it would have been like to live differently, to move, to see other places, to build her life around change rather than continuity. She said she thought both ways of living had their own losses, and that was all right. He asked if she had ever come close to leaving. She said once, the year after Robert died. She said the house had been unbearable that year in a way she had not anticipated, not because of what it held, but because of the specific and constant shape of his absence in it. Every room was a room he had been in. Every morning in the kitchen was a morning he was not there. She had thought seriously about going. She had looked at houses in the village. She had done the practical research. She stopped. She looked at the table for a moment. She said that what had kept her was the rose, the family cultivar in the east border, the one she had moved in November, the one she had been replanting when he arrived. It was an old variety, not available anywhere else. Her great-grandmother had grown it. If she left, she was not sure anyone would keep it, and she had felt, standing in front of it on a cold February morning 12 years ago, that she was not ready to be the last person who understood what it was. She said, "Some things need someone to stay." The kitchen was quiet. The evening light came through the window at a low angle, gold and specific. He said, "Yes." He said it as though he understood exactly what she meant, and she thought he probably did. By June, the east wing was finished. The guest suites were completed with the restored windows and the heritage paint color. the exact shade of cream, matched from the chip that Margaret had provided, and that the paint supplier had taken a week to replicate properly, and then been quietly proud of. The stonework that had been hidden behind plaster in one of the upper rooms was now visible behind glass, properly lit, with a small card explaining its history. The heritage officer had written a report on it that used the word remarkable 3 times. The kitchen had not changed. The range was where it had always been. The tiles were where they had always been, including the cracked one in the corner. On the day the scaffolding came down from the east wing, Margaret stood on the lawn and looked at it. The windows were the right color. The proportions were right. The house looked exactly like itself. She stood there for a while. The gardener who had been hired to help with the kitchen garden, a young man from the town who had turned out to be both talented and willing to learn, was working in the south border and noticed her standing there and had the good sense not to interrupt. Callum came and stood next to her. He was in his work clothes, jeans and a shirt with plaster on the cuff, which had become a common state. He looked at the east wing. He said, "Well?" She said, "Yes." They stood there for a while. He said he had been offered the opportunity to take on a further estate property in Scotland. Very different situation. A more straightforward conversion. Less complicated in terms of heritage. The numbers were good. His team was ready for it. She asked if he was going to take it. He said he was thinking about it. She asked if he was thinking about it because it was a good opportunity or because he was accustomed to keeping things moving. He was quiet for a moment. He said that was a direct question. She said she was a direct person. He said he was aware of that. He said he had been thinking, more generally, about his habit of moving from one thing to the next. He said that for most of his adult life this had seemed obviously correct. Keep moving. Keep building. Stay efficient. He said Harrow Hall was the first project he could remember in a long time where he had not wanted to move on to the next thing, where he had wanted to stay in the thing he was doing and see it properly. She said she thought staying in a thing properly was underrated. He said he was beginning to think so. He told her, a little while later, that he thought she had changed the way he saw what he was doing. Not the work exactly, but the purpose of the work. He had started out understanding the estate as an asset, which it was, and had ended up understanding it as something that had been entrusted to people over a long time by other people who had cared about it, and that his version of that trust was to do it well rather than just to do it profitably. He said he recognized this was perhaps an obvious thing, and he was not sure why it had taken him so long to arrive at it. She said sometimes you needed to be in the right place to understand the right things. She said she thought that was true of knowledge generally. It didn't work on a schedule. He said that was also direct. She said she had been having the same conversation with the same house for 41 years. You got direct eventually. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. Really laugh. Not the managed, measured thing she had seen him produce in professional contexts, but the actual version, which came from somewhere lower and took him by surprise. She thought, there you are. She did not say this. The locked room. He had not asked again. The notation on the revised blueprint said owner's discretion, and he had meant it, not as a courtesy, but as a statement of what he understood by then. The room was not storage. It was something else. She had been thinking about it since the February they had spent working on the house, since the conversations that had moved gradually from renovation logistics to other things. She had been thinking about whether the time had come to go in. On a Saturday afternoon in August, a warm afternoon, the kitchen garden at its fullest, the east border roses in bloom, She went and got the key from where it had lived for 12 years in the drawer of her bedside table, and she walked down the upper corridor, and she unlocked the door. She went in alone. She had been in this room every day for 23 years, and then not for 12, and the quality of absence in it was profound and specific. His books were on the shelf in the order he had kept them. His reading glasses were on the desk, folded. A jacket hung on the back of the door. The old one he used to wear when he was doing things around the house. She stood in the middle of the room for a long time. She picked up the reading glasses. She held them in her hands. She put them down. She sat in the chair by the window, his chair, where he used to read in the evenings, and she looked at the view he used to look at, the kitchen garden from above, the south wall with its medieval foundation, the roses in the east border. She sat there for an hour, maybe longer. She was not ready to sort it, but she was no longer certain that sorting it meant what she had thought it meant, that to sort it was to end it, to put him away, to agree to something she was not willing to agree to. She thought now that perhaps it just meant finding a form that she could live alongside, not removing him from the house. He was in the house the way her father was in the house, the way her grandmother was in the kitchen tiles, the way her grandfather was in the oak tree. He was here. He would stay here. The sorting was just the rearrangement of objects. The presence was not in the objects. She stood up. She went to the bookshelf. She took one book, a novel he had been halfway through, and she carried it with her when she left. She locked the door behind her. She went downstairs. She put the book on the kitchen table. She made tea. When Callum came in later, she was at the table with the book open in front of her. He looked at the book. He looked at her. He did not ask. She said, "I went in." He said, "Good." Just that. One word, which was the right amount. She poured him tea. The formal opening of the estate as a venue was in September. Claire had managed the event side of things with considerable competence, and there was a modest gathering, local press, a few people from the Heritage Organization, the county councillor who had been involved in the listed building discussions, some of the contractors who had done the work. The young gardener had cut the lawn with particular care that morning. Margaret stood near the kitchen garden wall and watched the proceedings with the composed attention she brought to most things. She had dressed for it, not formally, but carefully. She wore a dark green coat that suited her, and practical shoes that were clean for once. Callum said a few words about the project. He said it clearly and without excess. He talked about what they had tried to do, not to transform the house, but to restore it, and then to make a place that carried its history forward without turning it into a museum. He said this was harder than it sounded, and that it required understanding what mattered about a place and why. He looked at Margaret when he said this last part, briefly and without emphasis, but she saw it. After the speeches, there was food from the kitchen. The head chef had been using the kitchen for 2 weeks to prepare for this, under Margaret's watchful and occasionally firm guidance on the subject of the range. The food was excellent. Margaret ate a small amount of it standing near the kitchen garden wall, and watched people moving through the rooms and the garden with the careful attention of someone who is seeing their familiar world through the eyes of strangers. She thought, "It's all right. The house is all right." She had not been entirely sure it would be. She had told herself she was sure because she had made a decision and she did not go back on decisions. But underneath the certainty there had been a steady undertone of fear, not dramatic, not destabilizing, but present. The fear that she had made the wrong call, that she had trusted wrong, that the house would come out the other side of this as something she no longer recognized. It had not. It was recognizable. More than that, it was itself, still, but also cared for in a new way, attended to with resources and skill that she had never had access to alone. The east wing window frames would last another 50 years with the work that had been done on them. The heritage stonework would be seen now, rather than hidden. The kitchen garden wall was structurally sound for the first time in years. She looked at the oak tree. It was enormous in the September evening light, throwing its shadow across the drive in a long diagonal. Her grandfather had planted it as a young tree in 1953. He had been 28. He would have had no idea that it would grow to this. He planted it anyway. Callum found her near the kitchen garden wall after most of the guests had moved inside. He stood next to her. He looked at the oak tree too. He said the event had gone well. She said it had. He said Claire was pleased with the venue feedback. Margaret said she was glad to hear it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had turned down the Scotland project. She looked at him. He was looking at the tree. He said he had thought about it seriously. The numbers were good, as he had said. The work was straightforward. His team could have handled it without him. He could have been there and back in 6 months, and then moved to the next thing, and Harrow Hall would have been managed in his absence by competent people and would have functioned perfectly well. She asked what made him decide against it. He said he thought he had been confusing movement with progress for a very long time. He said he had spent 20 years getting very good at going forward and had not spent enough time learning to stay still. He said staying still turned out to require a completely different set of skills that he had not yet mastered and thought he would like to work on. She asked if he was going to stay. He said he thought he was. He said he was going to keep the London office running. Claire was more than capable of managing the portfolio, and be here for most of the time, overseeing the estate, learning what a house like this needed over the long term, being the kind of person who understood load-bearing walls. She said, "You don't know anything about load-bearing walls." He said, "Not yet." She looked at him. That careful, slightly uncertain expression again. The one she had begun to associate with him telling the truth about something. She said, "It takes a long time." He said, "I know." She turned back to the oak tree. The evening light was doing what it did in September. Amber and long, making everything look significant, which in this case it was. She said, "My grandfather planted that tree in 1953. He was 28 years old. He didn't see it grow to this. He was gone before it was half the size it is now. But he knew it would grow, and he planted it anyway." She said, "That's the thing about staying somewhere. You're not just here for yourself. You're here for what comes after." Callum looked at the tree for a long time. He said he thought that was the truest thing he had heard in a long time. She said, "It's just a tree." He said, "I know what you mean." She did not doubt that he did. The last of the evening light settled over the drive, and the garden and the great oak tree, and inside the house the sounds of conversation and carefully managed historic character continued. And the kitchen was warm, with the specific warmth it had always had, and the tile in the corner had its old crack, and the rose in the east border had new growth going into its first full autumn, tentative and correct, and entirely sure of its roots. Some things survive better if you move them before the hard cold settles in. Some things survive because someone stayed. Both things were true. Both things had always been true. The autumn turned properly cold in October. Margaret noticed it first in the garden, the way the early morning ground held a thin frost by the 3rd week of the month, the way the rose in the east border went quiet in the way roses do before winter, pulling everything inward, conserving. She cut it back by a third, which was what it needed, and added a mulch of compost around the base, and left it to manage the cold in its own way. The estate was open for its first bookings. A family gathering took one weekend. 12 people in the guest suites. A celebration in the dining hall that went late into the night with music and the kind of laughter that carries through old walls. Margaret heard it from the east wing and thought, the house sounds like itself. She had not expected to feel this. She had expected to feel observed, or managed, or reduced in some way she could not yet name. She had expected the arrival of paying guests to change something fundamental about the nature of the place, to overlay it with a transactional quality that would sit uneasily against the particular intimacy of a house she had known this long. She had prepared herself for this feeling. She had decided she could tolerate it if it was the cost of what she had gained. It had not happened. The guests moved through the rooms with care, because the rooms asked for care, not in any explicit way, but in the same way a cathedral asks for a certain quality of attention without any sign telling you so. You feel it. You adjust to it. The house had always had this quality. Apparently it had kept it. Callum was there for the first 2 bookings, not intrusively. He was not the kind of person who hovered, but present, available, learning what it meant to be responsible for a place, rather than just for its financial performance. He asked questions she had not expected him to ask. What happened to the fireplaces in the guest suites when the temperature dropped sharply? Did they draw well? Did the flues need clearing after a wet autumn? What was the history of the brick in the kitchen garden wall, and why did it look different in the south section? When did the oak tree need its canopy assessed? He had heard that old trees this size required regular professional attention, and he wanted to make sure it was properly scheduled. She answered these questions. She noticed that his questions were getting better, more specific, better targeted. He was learning the house the way she had learned it, which was slowly and by repetition. You could not rush it. He seemed to understand this. He had set up a proper office in one of the estate's smaller rooms, a former study off the main hall, not large, with a window looking out toward the kitchen garden. Claire came up from London twice a month. The rest of the time his work was managed from here, in the particular mixture of video calls and document reviews and decision-making that constituted his professional life. He was efficient and focused during working hours, and then, when work was done, he came into the kitchen and was something else. A version of himself that was less managed, that asked questions he could not answer efficiently, that sat with things instead of resolving them. He told her one evening about his childhood. Not the story she had already heard, the flat, the lorry, the practical lessons, but an earlier part. He had been, he said, a child who liked to build things. He had built elaborate structures out of whatever was available: cardboard boxes, wooden pallets, bricks from a neighbor's demolished garden wall. He had built them not to last, but to see how they worked. He had pulled them apart and built them differently. He had learned, he said, to understand things by taking them apart. He said, "I think I have been taking things apart for a very long time, buying them and taking them apart and rebuilding them to perform better. And I thought that was the same as understanding them." He stopped. He looked at the table. He said, "It isn't quite the same thing." She said, "No." She said she thought there was a version of understanding that came from taking things apart, and a different version that came from staying close to something until it told you what it was. She said she thought both were real. She said she suspected he had the first kind very thoroughly and was working on the second. He said that was a generous assessment. She said she was not being generous. She was being accurate. He said, "You're often right about things." She said, "Yes." He looked at her. She did not look away. There was something in the kitchen between them that had been building for months. She was not so old or so removed from the world that she could not name it, but it sat between them quietly, and they let it sit, because they were both, in their different ways, people who understood that some things grew better without being rushed. She thought about what she had told him about the rose. Some things survive better if you move them before the hard cold settles in. And some things, she thought now, needed to be left in place and given time. She poured more tea. He accepted it. The kitchen was warm, and outside the first proper frost of autumn was settling over the garden, and the house was making its particular sounds. The east wing boiler finding its warmth, the timber settling, the oak tree in the wind, and all of it was familiar, and all of it was the same, and all of it was, quietly and without drama, entirely changed. November came. Margaret had a habit in November of walking the full perimeter of the estate on the first Sunday of the month. She had done this for years. She couldn't now remember when she had started, only that it had become a fixture of the year, a way of taking account, walking the boundary, noting what needed attention. She set off after breakfast on the first Sunday, in her boots and wax jacket, with a notebook she used to record anything that needed following up. The morning was gray and still, and the ground was soft underfoot. She walked along the south wall, which was in good repair now after the summer's work. The medieval section properly assessed and stabilized, the rest repointed where it had needed it. She walked the east boundary through the wood, where the beech trees were holding onto their last copper leaves. She walked the north edge along the lane. She heard footsteps behind her after half an hour, and did not need to look to know who it was. Callum fell into step beside her. He was wearing a coat that was slightly too light for the weather, and boots that were right for the terrain. He had learned about the boots quickly after an incident with mud and an inadequate pair of town shoes in his first month, which he did not talk about, but which the young gardener had mentioned to her with quiet amusement. He said good morning. She said good morning. He asked if she minded if he walked. She said no. They walked the north edge in silence, which was comfortable. The lane was quiet. No cars yet on a Sunday morning. Just the sound of rooks somewhere in the north wood, and the soft give of the ground underfoot. He asked what she was looking for. She said anything that needed attention. She said the estate was like a conversation. If you stopped paying attention for too long, you lost the thread of it. He said, "Can I learn to do this?" She said, "The walk?" He said, "The noticing." She thought about this. She said, "Yes, but it takes time. You have to know what everything looks like when it's right, so you can see when it isn't." He said, "How do you know what right looks like?" She said, "You look for a long time." He said, "That's a very patient way to learn something." She said, "There isn't another way. Not for this." They walked the east boundary through the wood. He was quiet and attentive. She noticed that he looked at things without needing to categorize them immediately. He looked and then looked again, which was the right instinct. She had expected him to ask questions constantly, which was how he had been in the early months. He had become quieter. She thought this was good. In the southeast corner, where the wood met the kitchen garden wall, there was a section of fence that needed replacing. She noted it. Near the south gate, there was a tree whose lower branches were encroaching on the wall. She noted that too. On the south wall itself, in the medieval section, she stopped and examined a small area she had been watching since summer. It was fine. She noted that it was fine. They came back around to the main approach and walked up the drive with the oak tree ahead of them, enormous and still in the gray morning. Callum said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about being here for what comes after." She said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know who planted this tree. Not the name, not the face. He's entirely gone. But I know he was 28 years old, and he planted a tree, and it grew. I know that. He's here in that. He's not gone. Not entirely." She said, "No, not entirely." He looked at the tree. He said, "I've never thought about my work that way before. What it leaves after I'm done with it. Not in terms of the financial return. Just, what shape does it leave things in?" She said she thought that was one of the more important questions a person could ask about their work. He said, "I'm asking it late." She said, "You're asking it. That's enough." They stood at the foot of the drive and looked at the oak tree. The light was beginning to find a way through the cloud cover, pale and thin, but genuine. The kind of November light that makes gray things look silver. He said her name, just her name. She looked at him. He said, "Thank you for not leaving. I know I didn't give you a reason to stay. At the beginning, I came here with a plan that had no place for you in it, and you stayed anyway. And everything that came after that came from the fact that you stayed." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I didn't stay for you." He said, "I know." She said, "But I'm glad you came." She said it simply, as a fact, which was what it was. She turned and walked toward the house, and the November light came through the oak branches and made long shadows across the drive, and the kitchen garden was waiting with its winter quietness, and somewhere in the east border the rose was resting in the cold, roots going deeper. She found him in the library that evening. He was reading, an old book from the shelves, something she recognized from the spines. He had a habit now of reading in the library in the evenings when he was not working, which she thought was good for him and good for the room, which had too long been unread in. She sat in the chair across from him. It was the chair she had sat in when she was 14, watching her father sleep after he finished the ceiling. She had sat in it hundreds of times since. She sat in it now, and felt all those occasions layered under the present one, the way the house itself was layered, not as weight, but as depth. She opened her own book, the novel she had taken from Robert's room. She had been reading it slowly, a few pages at a time. She was 3/4 of the way through. She did not know how it ended. Robert had not known how it ended Ender, which had bothered her for a long time. The idea of him stopped in the middle, not getting to finish. It bothered her less now. She was reading it for both of them, which seemed right. The library was warm. The house was settling around them in its evening way. Outside the window, the garden was dark, and the oak tree was a darker shape against the gray sky, vast and assured. Callum turned a page. She turned a page. The fire in the library grate, which Callum had learned to lay properly after some early attempts that had required her intervention, burned steadily. The room was full of the good smell of old books and wood smoke and the particular quality of quiet that belongs to people reading in the same room. She thought about the things that had stayed and the things that had gone. Her grandmother's hands in the kitchen tiles. Her father's 3 weeks on the library ceiling. Robert's unfinished sentence, which she was finishing now, page by page, in the room where her father had slept. The rose her great-grandmother had grown, which was in the east border, going deeper-rooted into its second winter. She thought about Callum's father behind the wheel of the lorry in the early mornings, patient and reliable, going to the same places in the same order. His son watching and learning something about persistence, even as he drove away from it. She thought about the kinds of inheritance that are not money and not property, but are something more difficult to name, the things passed forward, not deliberately, but simply by the act of staying close to them, being shaped by them, carrying them into the next version of the day. She turned another page. He turned another page. The fire settled. The oak tree held the wind outside. The house made its familiar sounds, the sounds she had known before she knew anything else. The vocabulary of a place that had been lived in and cared for across so many versions of itself that it had become something more than a building. A long, slow, compound sentence that no single person had begun or would finish, but that each of them had extended, in their own time, by showing up, by staying, by paying attention, by believing, without needing to explain why, that the thing they were tending was worth the tending. She did not look up from her book, neither did he. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and a great deal that was better left as silence had been left as silence, and the space between two people reading by a fire in a room that had been waiting a long time to be a library again was not empty but full. Full in the way that real things are full, not with noise or declaration, but with the weight of what is actually there. The kitchen would be there in the morning, with the cracked tile and the warm range, and the particular light that came through the east window in winter, thin and precise and entirely itself. The rose would be there in the east border, resting in the cold, preparing for spring. The oak tree would be there at the end of the drive, reaching its branches in every direction, carrying a full century of trust in the ground beneath it. And Margaret Ashworth would be there, as she had always been, as she intended to go on being, moving through the house in the early morning before the sun, listening for the sounds that told her all was well, adjusting what needed adjusting, noting what needed noting, staying present to the long conversation that a place like this required, and that she, out of everyone, understood how to have. She turned the last page of the chapter. She looked up. Across the library, in the chair by the fire, Callum was asleep with the book open in his lap. He had done what her father had done in this room 40 years ago, sat down and done something whole and real, and been overtaken by rest. He looked younger when he was sleeping, less managed, more himself. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stood up quietly, and she put her own book on the side table with the page marked, and she took the blanket from the arm of the chair and set it over him with the same care she brought to every practical task, and she went to the door. She stopped at the door. She looked back at the room, the fire, the books on the shelves, the man asleep in the chair, the ceiling her father had made with his own hands, the window going dark against the November night. She thought, yes, just that, yes. She turned off the overhead light, and left the fire, and went down the corridor to the kitchen, and put the kettle on for morning.